Hello all, this is our final lecture in week 8, and in our final lecture we're going to talk about international perspective. So our focus up till now has really been on the American struggle for civil rights from the founding of our country to the present day. But in our final lecture we're going to look at some of the international efforts that have made for civil rights and human rights, especially the United Nations. So the first international event that I'm going to kind of focus on is the Nuremberg trials. A lot of our events, again, come out of World War II. So when people tell you that, so when we talk about World War II as kind of this watershed changing moment for the 20th century, we're not just talking about for America. We're talking about the whole world. Many things changed because of World War II. So World War II was one of the first wars where they declared war crimes and actually tried people in an international tribunal after the war. These were the Nuremberg trials in 1945 and 46. Judges from Allied powers, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States presided over the hearing of 22 major Nazi criminals. So 12 of those Nazis were sentenced to death, but a lot of them received small prison sentences or not at all. The reality was many of, especially the lower levels, passed the blame up the chain of command. And although I'm saying the Nuremberg trials took place in 1945 and 1946, Nazi hunters continued to bring Nazis to justice through the 20th century. Because this continued to happen, and in fact, Eichmann, who was brought to justice in the early 1960s, was a major supporter of the Nazis. And there are actually still trials going on today. The Geneva Conventions, the first three were in 1864, 1906, and 1929. They were developed in connection with the Red Cross, which just really started around the time of the first Geneva Convention. It was updated in 1949. The Geneva Convention, what is a series of treaties on the treatments of civilians, prisoners of war, and soldiers who are otherwise rendered out of combat or incapable of fighting. And I did not include all of the pieces of the convention. I do have in my reference slide the text of the Geneva Convention so that you can go look at, but some of the documents we're talking about this week are very long. So while my lecture this week is very short, I hope that you guys will spend some time with my reference slides and my references in my Word documents, and that you guys will go and you'll actually read some of these documents while they're not required reading. We do have a lot of required reading this week, which is why my lectures are kind of on the light side. Okay, so the final point is the United Nations and the post-World War II efforts for human rights. The predecessor was the League of Nations. After World War II, Woodrow Wilson was very concerned that something like this could happen again very easily. He felt like we needed a world alliance in order to prevent future world wars, and his goal was to see the League of Nations. He felt that the Americans needed to participate in the world stage, and that we needed to be allied in order to prevent future world conflicts. Unfortunately, after World War I, most Americans went back to isolationism, and they were not interested in being involved in what they called European problems. So they really did. America never actually joined the League of Nations, and it folded shortly after World War I. It was not even in effect all that long. In 1942, President Roosevelt first coined the term United Nations, as 26 nations promised to continue fighting against the Axis powers. In 1945, the United Nations Charter was drawn up. It was ratified by several of the major signatories later in 1945 in October. In 1946 was the first UN resolution that called for people to use nuclear power peacefully and get rid of nuclear arms. In 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was put out by the United Nations. And it's probably one of the most important pieces of international human rights legislation or treaty. It sets up for the first time a standard of human rights that all countries should maintain. And basically, countries that are part of the United Nations are agreeing that they should be maintaining this. Whether they actually do or not is a different matter. But basically, it had input from different cultures, nationalities, and legal backgrounds, and was a consensus of what basic human rights should look like, which was in itself a pretty amazing idea. It contains 30 articles that elaborate the basic standards, including the right to equality, to own property, and the right to freedom from slavery. And like I said, this was pretty monumental because this many countries were able to, with their different cultures, agree on this large Declaration of Rights. The UN continues to maintain these ideas of international human rights through many different organizations. The UN is no longer just kind of the UN. There's the UN Commission on Human Rights, the United Nations Children's Fund, the United Nations Development Fund for Women, and World Health Organization, and there are many more that strive for not only coming up with basic standards for human rights, talking about what human rights should look like, including that they've hosted international women's rights conferences, but also funding and enforcement for some of those. So conclusion this week. World War II, again, was central to a larger call for human rights. One thing that we clearly don't get to talk about in our class is the Holocaust. What Germany and the Nazis did during the Holocaust was really, I think, a wake-up call to a lot of people. The idea that people could be treated that way en masse, have their basic human rights. We're not even talking about civil rights at that point. We're talking about the right to live, removed from them en masse, and nobody stopped it until much later is clearly disturbing to a lot of the world. And I think that many people's experiences with World War II caused them to call for their own civil rights or for the rights of others, and to realize that we need governing bodies in place to watch out for these kind of civil rights. It continues, the UN continues to be a source of treaties and actions that call for human rights. Over the years, the UN has had controversies, but in the end, it really is still a united international organization that looks to maintain peace and to seek out ways to improve human rights in the international world. And that's a really important thing. So my reference slide this week, as I mentioned, I did not read to you, but I hope that you will read, because that is by no means less important. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, also a link to the UN Charter, and I hope that you guys will take time to go out there and read those documents, because they're really important to the international perspective of human rights. Thanks, guys, and have a great day.